Happy Wednesday, fourth graders. Today in writing, we are going to talk about using descriptive language, which makes our story a bit more interesting. So our goal is to use strong and more descriptive words to make our stories more detailed and interesting to our readers. What do we mean when we say to use descriptive language? That can be kind of a tricky word and it can be kind of confusing on what it actually means. What we mean is that authors don't write the most simple words in every sentence. They reach and they research to find strong verbs, adjectives, and adverbs that are able to better describe the scenes in a story or the character's actions. So we're going to look at a few examples on the next page. For example, here's kind of a boring sentence. Michael walked down the street. It tells us what Michael's doing, but it's not very exciting. Here's a more descriptive word choice. Michael slowly strolled down the block. That makes it a bit easier for our readers to picture that in their minds, and it's much more interesting than just Michael walked down the street. The next one is Gianna looked up at the tall building. Here's it more descriptive and a bit better described. Gianna stared in awe at the massive tower in front of her. So we can really see Gianna staring up. You can kind of see her looking up at this big tower, and that's just a lot more interesting to read than the other one. And finally, Jenny moved to the beat of the music. Here's the more descriptive version. Jenny swayed back and forth to the rhythm of the song. So it helps us picture it better, and it's way more interesting. So here are some examples. I'm going to give you guys a couple of seconds to look at what we could use instead. But the first one is the puppy laid on his bed. So what could we write instead? How about the puppy curled up on his fuzzy bed? So that we are changing laid to curled up and adding fuzzy in front of bed so it describes what the bed is like so you can picture it. The next one is Rob walked to the top of the hill. What could we change in that? How about Rob hiked to the top of the massive hill? That's much more descriptive. And finally, Grandpa slept in his chair. How about we say Grandpa was snoring loudly in his chair. So those are some examples of how we can use better and more descriptive words to make things more interesting for our readers. Let's think back to the story that Mr. Hoffman has been writing. So there's a lot of places in here that we could probably add some stronger details to make it more interesting. So the first one, let's read this first sentence here. The next day at school, a new kid stood in front of the class looking down at the ground. How about instead of looking down at the ground, we say, shaped it to yellow, staring at his sneakers. So we're changed looking at the ground to staring at his sneakers. A bit more descriptive. See if I'm change it to yellow. There we go. And then the next sentence, Will couldn't help but notice he looked both scared and tired at the same time. So a better way to say scared is we could say he was feeling anxious. Anxious is a little bit more descriptive than scared. Move my guy up here. Good morning, everyone. I would like to introduce you to TJ, Miss Henderson stated. He just moved to town from Arizona. Let's do everything we can to give him a warm welcome. She pointed at the back of the room where there was a seat next to Will. TJ gathered all of his belongings and moved towards his new seat. While he was trying to carry all of his new stuff, well, stuff can be a bit more descriptive, so why don't we change stuff to materials? And then I think it says stuff again in here. Gina stuck her foot out and tripped in. All of TJ's stuff went flying across the floor and the other students laughed. So how about instead of stuff or materials this time, we say supplies. So just another way to say stuff that's more specific. Supplies went flying across the floor and the other students laughed. Will knew that feeling all too well, and he thought about what to do. How about we change thought about to contemplated? That is a much more descriptive word than thought about. So the changes that we've made here weren't big changes. You know, I didn't rewrite the story, but I changed some words to make it a bit more interesting. So today your job is to go back in your story and do what I just did with Mr. Hoffman's story. Find boring words or sentences that can be changed or replaced to make the story more interesting. And then you do not need to submit your entire story rewritten. We want you to actually just submit a list of what you changed in your story, and you need to have at least 5 examples. So like how Mr. Hoffman has right here, his list of what we changed in his story. So number 1, I changed looked at the floor to stared at his sneakers. And number 2 is I changed the word scared to anxious. So he just goes down and lists all of the changes that we made in his story. That's what we want you to do. You do not need to write your whole story again in the submission box for us. And then after you change those words, you need to go back and keep working on your story. There's always improvements that can be made, and there's always stuff that can be added. So keep adding on, add more scenes, add more details, and make it more interesting. That is all for today. Thank you so much for listening, 4th graders, and we will see you tomorrow.